Okay, we'll be kicking off in a moment. I'll just wait for a few more people to sit down. And while they are, just to introduce myself and the panel, I'm Grant Fitzner. I'm Acting Director General for Economic, Social and Environmental Statistics at the ONS. And we're talking in this session about two very important topics dear to my heart, trade and productivity, and the connection between them. And we have a very distinguished panel, starting on my left, Mairi Spowage from the University of Strathclyde, who also is a non-executive director on the UK Statistics Authority, so I better be careful what I say, otherwise she'll report back to the chair. Greg Thwaites, Research Director at the Resolution Foundation, Associate Professor at the University of Nottingham. Swati Dhingra, Member of the Monetary Policy Committee at the Bank of England and Associate Professor at LSE, that's right. And Sophie Piton, a Senior Research Advisor at the Bank of England. And we have a guest presentation for about 10 minutes to kind of set the scene for this. And this Trade and Productivity in British Firms is a paper that will be coming out shortly by ESCoE as a discussion paper. It's funded by the Department for Business and Trade and was a collaboration with Nikos at DBT. And Christina is formerly of ONS and is on comment to the OECD, the Productivity, Innovation and Entrepreneurship Directorate. So Christina, would you like to take us through?
Thank you very much. So we're here to talk about trade and productivity in British firms from 2005 to 2022, analysis done looking at firm-level microdata. This is work with my brilliant co-author, Kyle Jones, who I hope is in the audience, and funded, as Grant mentioned, by the Department for Business and Trade and Nikos in particular. Trade is important for I'm sorry. Well, we'll get to the next slide eventually. Trade is important for the UK's sort of policy landscape. In November, the Chancellor published her industrial strategy. Thank you very much. Her industrial strategy, and trade was really at the heart of that. It identified sort of areas around trade as core strengths of the UK's global services industry. Its standing as one of the largest as one of the largest trading nations in the world. But it was also important as a lever to deliver on the government's growth mission. So the Chancellor mentions sort of forging trade partnerships with what she calls powerhouse economies as important on delivering growth. Out of the 8 sectors that the strategy identifies as sectors that will deliver prosperity, 4 of those are the largest UK exporters, manufacturing, professional services, ICT. And it also talks about the importance of business support programs to help firms overcome trade barriers. But of course, trade has also been a very, very shifting environment. The UK has redefined its relationship with Europe. Recently, the US is sort of renegotiating its own trade relationships as well, which is important for the UK because the US is an important trade partner. I should say most of these are screen grabs from the Department for Business and Trade website in the last couple of weeks, and I thought that was a good way to convince you, if there's anyone unconvinced, that trade is sort of important and becoming more and more important in a shifting landscape for policymakers. So, it's as good of a time as any to talk about the role of trade and productivity. The UK has a productivity problem, and with trade being on the forefront of policymaking, it's important to give most up-to-date evidence and reevaluate what its role with productivity is. I'm not going to bother you too much about the data that we used, but this is a measurement conference, so I wanted to at least talk about what are the data sets and maybe some of their pros and cons that you'll see have an impact in the results as well. This is work that builds on previous work the ONS has done, a paper by Philip Wales et al. That was published in 2018 that brings in customs data, links it with the annual business survey, and estimates the relationship between labor productivity and trading goods. We extend this by bringing the data all the way up to 2022 and bring in trade and services as well. We work both with the ABS and with customs data when it comes to trading goods, because there's complementary pros and cons, complementary advantages and disadvantages in measuring trade behavior in British firms in the two data sets. Not the least being that sort of in the customs declarations, there's a break in how we collect data after 2021 that we have to deal with. And before 2021, there's sort of a threshold above which firms have to export to be sampled. And so you'll see that when we talk about the trade productivity premium, these little nitty-gritty details are important because in the trading goods data set, you'll see firms appear a little bit more productive because of that threshold. So quickly, what do we find in the paper? When you naively compare traders with non-traders, traders appear to be quite a bit more productive, 42% in terms of GVA per worker in the ABS, 58 when you look at HMRC trading goods data. Some of that is explained by the underlying characteristics of firms. So when you control by industry, employment size, foreign ownership, the gap comes down a bit to 35 to 47%. But unfortunately, when we try to say a little bit about the causal direction of that relationship, is it that trade drives productivity through technological upgrading, for example, or is it that more productive firms choose to trade? We do find, consistent with the literature, that most of the productivity gap seems to be due to selection, so due to productive firms choosing to trade. We find that future goods exporters are already more productive before the time of first export. And when we compare just exporters to be, so try and take out the selection effect, maybe see if we can estimate the impact of trade on productivity, so the other direction, we find an impact of around 12%. So when we just compare exporters to be only conditional and observable characteristics, we assume the timing of trade is exogenous, and we find that while there's no significant productivity differences before, there's a 12% gap in the first year of entering international markets. This effect is driven by large exporters in our data set, and while it comes a bit too fast to be technological upgrading, we do see some long-run effects in ICT and investment. So I'm going to leave you with some caveats and some future extensions, hopefully to open up an interesting discussion. Obviously, this is the impact on a firm. It doesn't talk about or capture the impact on aggregate productivity because it misses things like general equilibrium effects or spillover effects, and evidence from the firm-to-firm transactions data literature suggests that spillover effects might be important. It doesn't deal with things that might be happening in the business register, so we follow the same firm over time. But if new statistical units get created as firm begins to trade, we might miss some important dynamics there. And probably one of the most important omissions is that when we look at productivity, we care about productivity a lot in this country, but productivity is a means to an end. We care about productivity to still a line of stagnation because we believe it's ultimately the only way to raise material living standards in the long run. And the work doesn't get to what is the impact on household living standards, which is a great way to segue into my last slide on data development. This work was an incredible project to bring important data sets about trade together. We should do more in bringing administrative data sets in the picture. We should use corporate tax data to measure trade and services from administrative information like we do for trading goods. It would allow us to estimate more complicated measures of productivity like TFP, not just labor productivity. We should extend the data set to include linked employer-employee data to understand how and which workers benefit from trade. The ONS is already doing work on this year to bring in income tax, link it to the LBD, and give us that. And finally, we should try to integrate firm-to-firm transactions data to talk about this supply chain effects. We don't have VAT invoicing in the UK, but the ONS is doing work to use bank transactions to give us that. And with that, I'm going to pass back to the panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Christina. You covered a huge amount of ground in about 7 minutes. For anyone interested, there's a lot more in the paper, so do look out for it when it's published. And really, I think just managed to touch on kind of the key conclusions, methods, and where next. And on the where next, yes, we are keen, subject to the usual caveats about resources, priorities, etc., to kind of have a proper UK linked employer-employee data set. And also to build on the existing longitudinal business database, which I should point out is available in the Secure Research Service for researchers. So let's kick off with our panel, and I'll start with you, Mairi.
Thank you. And this research is so interesting and linked to lots of the research we're doing at Strathclyde as part of the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy, which is a partnership between Sussex, Nottingham, Strathclyde, Queen's and Cardiff universities. And it's the only trade policy focused research centre in the UK, which I can I'm sure everyone will agree is very important given the sort of current environment and the fact that the UK, since leaving the EU, is making its first independent, its independent trade policy for the first time in 50 years. The work that we're doing as part of the CITP chimes very nicely with the research that Christina has presented. And our interest is about whether and how exporting firms are similar or not to the average firm in the sector. And this is because a lot of benefits of trade deals are expressed as, it's going to change GDP so much. But a lot of the way that the modelling and underlying data is kind of structured is essentially assuming that an exporting firm is the same as the average firm in the sector. Now, we all know that that's not true, as Christina has presented with productivity, but there are lots of other ways that the exporting firms are different. Their supply chains are different. They tend to be importers more. They have a higher import intensity. The pattern of their purchases is different. The level of the capital investment that they carry out is different. The nature of their supply chain is quite different. So what we're trying to do through our research is to get to the point where we can split up our understanding of the economy into exporting and non-exporting firms to really understand how those supply chains are different, because the multiplier effects of this is going to be different when you're talking about exporting firms. But as Christina also mentioned, we're doing a lot to link changes in trade to how this impacts on employees and how it impacts on different types of employees. We did a project with DBT a number of years ago, which is looking at jobs related to trade, but again, there were lots of assumptions that had to be made about the nature of exporting firms. And what we're doing is exploiting some of the data in the Secure Research Service, including linking data through the Annual Business Survey and ASH to understand the nature of the employment in exporting firms to get a much better understanding through microdata of what these impacts actually are. I can't really talk about all of this research that we're doing, and we are getting to a point soon where we'll be outputting a new version of the Jobs and Trade database, which will have breakdowns for characteristics like sex, income level and skill level, for us understanding changes in trade data without mentioning data and the challenges around data access for trade. I'm sure any of you who work on trade will know the challenges that exist, but there has been progress. There has been a lot of progress recently. There is more linked information that, through ONS, the HMRC as the data owner, and DBT as a policy department working together, making more available for researchers in the Secure Research Service. But the progress has been limited and slow, and we need to go much faster to allow researchers to do the research on trade that we need to happen to inform policy much better. So I welcome the progress that's been made, but we need to go further to make sure that researchers have access to data in a way that's going to encourage research on trade. We also have, as part of the linked employee-employer database project, as part of ESCoE, developed a use case on trade, because it really is an important part of the story when we're thinking about the economy, not just that we're going to boost GDP, but who's going to benefit, where in the country are they, and what sorts of jobs are we going to be protecting through changing trading arrangements. And just to say that as part of our project through the Centre for Inclusive Trade Policy, we're planning to publish quite a lot of data for reuse for researchers. So look out for that if you're interested, because what we want to do is to ensure that these are useful for other researchers and that they're sort of put through their paces and really will inform other researchers.
Greg.
Thank you, Grant and Mairi. So I'm Greg. I work at the Resolution Foundation, which is a think tank based in Westminster and also at the University of Nottingham. I'm going to talk to you for a few minutes about a thing I've been working on for 9 years now, which is called the Decision Maker Panel. So I was at the Bank of England at the time of the Brexit referendum, and the referendum happened, and we realised we didn't have the information that we needed to analyse the effect that Brexit was going to have on the corporate sector. So we set up a new survey from scratch very quickly. We established a call centre at the bank, and in the course of doing this, I developed an increased respect for the ONS, who have to collect statistics every day. This survey's been running for 9 years now. One of the things I've learned about, as well as learning a lot about the economy along the way, is that what you call things matters. So we were going to call it the Brexit survey at the beginning, and then our co-author Nick Bloom said, no, that's a terrible idea, because if you put the word Brexit in the title, you're going to bias the sample, and then if you call it a survey, no one's going to want to do it. We can't compel people to do it, so we had to cajole them, and so calling it the decision maker panel was a kind of decision maker is kind of flattery, and then panel sounds more exciting, marginally more exciting than survey. I say that as someone who's sitting on a panel right now. Anyway, so what we've been doing since 2016 is surveying thousands of UK firms every month. This is longitudinal data. It's like filling the bath with the plug out. Some firms leave, and then you have to put new ones in. We ask firms about a range of objective things like their sales and their employment, and then we also ask them some subjective things as well. So what do they think is going to happen in the future? How do they think certain shocks in the economy are affecting them now? And then as the world has been such an exciting place over the past 9 years, the shocks we've been asking them about have changed. So we started off asking a lot about Brexit, then we asked them about COVID, then we asked them about Ukraine, we asked them about national living wage increases or NICS increases, whatever happens. Basically, whatever Swati asks us to ask them, we ask them. And that's because the project is mostly based at the Bank of England. So what did we find on Brexit? Well, what we did was we asked firms how exposed they were to Brexit, both in terms of like subjectively, how big a deal is this for you? And then we've also merged with other data to find other objective measures of exposure to the European Union, which isn't just exports. So it's things like how many of your directors are from EU countries other than the UK. Do you source your supplies, are your suppliers in the European Union as well, and your staff? So these other measures of exposure turn out to be very important too. And then we basically look at the cross-section of exposure to Brexit on these different measures and see how it correlates with changes in investment and employment and output and productivity in the cross-section over time. And we find that Brexit has had a very large negative effect on UK GDP, bigger than the original official estimates, which were more like 4%. We're looking at more like, our latest numbers are more like 7%, which is expensive, isn't it? And then we also compare this with measures from macro data. So we have a synthetic control procedure as well, where we look at like a basket of other countries that behave like the UK before Brexit, and then we compare the UK to the average of that basket afterwards, and we get a similar number. So rather than kind of mid-single figures, we're getting high single figures effects of Brexit. As time passes, I think that this, what we can say is going to diminish, and I think that's partly because firms will enter and exit because of Brexit, or not enter and exit because of Brexit, and it's hard to say what those effects are going to be. And then there's also a problem with using cross-sectional information, like we've got in the decision maker panel, to answer aggregate questions, because ultimately you need to know, even a firm that says it's not at all exposed to Brexit or the EU may have output go up or down because of the shock. And so in the latest version of the paper, we build a DSG model enabling us to reconcile this kind of macro time series data with the micro data that we've got in the DMP. And of course, it's the strength of spillovers between firms that really matters there. So I think I've probably plugged this enough. I might be running out of time. Just to say that the government's very interested in this work. So the Chancellor reads what we write as well as the MPC. And I think what's becoming clear at the moment is that the government is kind of obsessed with growth, productivity growth, and rightly so, because as Christina pointed out, that's the only long-run source of increased prosperity, but is very timid on trade. And I think it's going to be really interesting to see when they've pulled all the other levers, whether they come back to the trade lever over the next few years.
Thank you. Swati.
Great. Thanks so much. So I'll start with talking a little bit about the paper. I think what's really great about this entire really massive data exercise is that one, even though I'm a trade economist, I'll say most trade people write really boring papers, which just tell you how much did trade barriers matter for trade, and we don't get to the ultimate answer of things that we actually care about: productivity, employment, all of those good things that we really want to sort of see progress in the country. So in that sense, I mean, linking up the ABS with the other measures of trade, I think that really puts us in that direction of trying to start answering those questions. And just as Greg said, ultimately that's finally what we want to get to, but most of our measures, even of trade itself, are just so incomplete because we don't really typically get what these knowledge spillovers from employees moving, etc., could be. So I think that's the real advantage of having this sort of data set. It also helps us understand what happens at the sort of much more granular regional level, industry level. And then finally, it gets us to the question that we ultimately care about normatively, which is to say, what should policy do, and what are the kinds of policies we need to ensure that trade becomes an engine of growth and gives us sort of all the good things that we want, which won't let us, which, as Greg and I have done previous work on Stagnation Nation, that's the kind of rut we want to break here. So really, huge thanks to Christina and everyone else who put all this work together. And my bugbear is going to be trade and services, which I think which is absolutely imperative for the UK to be able to think about where its place in the world is. So I'm going to spend some time talking about what the really big challenges there are and some of the work we've been doing to think about those things. My co-author Shania is in the audience here, so this is work that we've done jointly. So one of the big things, of course, is, and this is not a surprise to this audience, that 80% of our GBA comes from services. And yet we know very little about, even how to measure productivity in services, let alone some of the harder issues about things like non-tariff barriers, which is a really big issue that we've had to confront since the Brexit referendum and further on. Yeah. So just to give you a sense of, a lot of the work that got done around the Brexit referendum, what did we do with services trade? We didn't really have much of an idea of how to discipline it. So what we ended up doing was saying, well, typically the elasticity, which is if there's a 1% increase in trade cost, how much does trade change? We would take the number that we know from trade and goods and just use that and supplant it to services trade. So a lot of our measures out there, we don't know how to measure those non-tariff barriers. We don't know how to measure services trade in general very well. And then put on top of that, we don't know what the responsiveness of trade to trade policy is. So a lot of the work we've been trying to do now, and it's a very dirty word to say interdisciplinary, but that's the kind of work I started to do, which is work with a lawyer. And the lawyer's basically gone and codified the entire trade and cooperation agreement for us, and then we can start to think about which are the services where trade barriers have come into place, and with which countries in the European Union have they come into place. And from there, we can then start to think about, I'll first start with the boring question, how much did services trade change? And the hope is that we'll get to the point when the finer data sets become available to start asking the questions about, given that we exited from the deepest integration agreement out there, what impact did that have on productivity, on employment? And particularly that matters for productivity because tradable services are where a large fraction of our productivity growth over the years has come from. So what do we find till now? Of course, these are early days still. We've got the massive shock of COVID in the middle of, right when Brexit happens. And that's the reason the analysis becomes more useful when you start to think about the granular data where you hope that at least you'll be able to pick out sectors where these trade barriers have become more important and see those impacts more carefully. So let me give you an example of the kind of trade barriers that have come into being. So auditing services, one of the really big growth sectors. We've congratulated ourselves how well we've been doing on services exports. Well, let me spoil the party a little bit, so has everyone else. We're not exceptional. If anything, we've actually lagged behind. So let me start with an example of auditing services. France, you need to have residency to be able to provide auditing services. If you were an EU member, you wouldn't automatically be counted as a resident, but the moment you step out of the European Union, you are now a non-resident, and therefore the auditing services firm will have to satisfy some compliance criteria to be able to provide services to the European Union. And once you take into account all these sorts of trade barriers, what we find is that there's actually been a drop on the extensive margin, which means services exports of products that really get hit by these sorts of trade barriers under the TCA many of these exporters seem to drop out, these exported products. And the number is somewhere in the range of 6%. We've also looked at how we've done relative to other countries. So, for example, how have other OECD countries fared in terms of exporting to the European Union, and what does the UK look like in comparison to that? The numbers start to look a lot bigger. So for affected services, we think it's somewhere in the range of 8.5% drop in services exports relative to our peer countries. So there's more to come because a lot of this is changing very quickly. So if you were to just look at trade and goods data till 2022, the numbers look one way. If you start adding in 2023, 2024, we know some of these numbers are moving around because some of these lagged effects are coming in, some of the recovery from the pandemic is done. So that's a little bit where we're headed in the future, and I'm really looking forward to talking more to Christina about this really rich source of data that's going to help us understand these issues about what trade policy should be doing.
Thank you, Swati. Sophie.
Thank you. So Swati's discussion actually is very linked to what I'm going to talk about, which is another area that has been largely underexplored, which is trade in banking services. So a lot of the data that we've seen today and Christina's work, unfortunately, doesn't include the financial service sector, and yet financial services is a very important sector for the UK. So it's about 10% of GDP, and it's comparable in size to the manufacturing sector. So together, again, with Shania here in the audience, and another colleague at the Bank of England, so John Woods, we've been focusing on banking services trade recently. And so that's about 1/3 of total employment in the financial service sector. So we're doing so using the data that the Bank of England collects on UK resident banks. And so that's the data behind ONS official statistics on trade in banking services. So this is still work in progress, but I'll summarize what we've learned from this exercise with a focus specifically on measurement, given where measurement challenges, given where our ESCoE, and actually there are tons of measurement challenges, measuring trade in banking services, interpreting what that means, what exports are in banking services, and I hope inspire a bit more work on this area because I think we still have a lot to learn on this. So we look in more particularly in this work, we looked at how banks were affected by the changing barriers that came around Brexit. So as Swati explained, barriers for services, a lot of Brexit meant that the UK faced a lot of non-tariff barriers when leaving the EU. And in banking in particular, for UK resident banks, the loss of passporting meant that UK resident banks faced a huge rise in non-tariff barriers to either export to the EU or even establish branches to operate in the EU markets. So we focus, obviously barriers in the banking sector are set for regulatory reasons, but very little is known about their impact on trade in banking services. So this is really what we're trying to focus on. So what is the impact on bank exports of banking services to the EU? So in a nutshell, what I'll discuss is that we find no visible impact of Brexit on UK resident banks' exports to the EU relative to exports outside of the EU to the rest of the world. But what I'll explain is that this might reflect, at least in part, how we actually measure trade in services. And so to better capture changes in activity, we turn instead to stock data, so specifically the stock of cross-border loans and deposits that UK banks manage. And measure this way, we find significant changes in UK banks' activity following Brexit. But let me clarify first what I mean by trade in banking services. So to simplify, banks provide intermediation services. So they provide loans and they hold deposits. And they offer these services both to domestic clients and also to foreign clients. So these services are either priced explicitly, so through fees and commissions, or implicitly through interest margins. So you can think of charging a higher mortgage rate or paying a lower deposit rate to implicitly capture the revenue on the service of offering to help to hold this deposit or to offer the loan. So both charges, explicit or implicit, are used to measure exports, and the corresponding stocks of loans and deposits are the quantity behind those exports. So you can think in this way of trade in banking services in the same way you can think of trade in goods, which is a revenue from trade and the quantity traded. So explicit charges measured by fees and commissions, we do observe them. We have them by partner country, and we have them at the bank level. But the implicit revenue for lending and deposit services are not observed. By definition, they're implicit. So we impute those implicit charges. So you've probably already came across the concept of FISIM, which is financial intermediation services indirectly measured, which is this imputation of implicit charges. And so the UNS imputes these implicit margins, but the way they impute it assumes a similar unit margin across partner countries. So if one wants to look at the differential evolution of trade between the EU and the rest of the world, well, actually, most of the variation in FISIM at least will reflect variation in stocks, because the unit margin will be similar by definition, by the way it's imputed, between the EU and the rest of the world. And so it means that it's very hard to interpret how trade in banking services has evolved relative after Brexit. So when we look at how UK exports, so the sum of both explicit and implicit margins, have evolved for the EU relative to the rest of the world, we find no change relative to the two main Brexit dates, so the referendum in 2016 or the new trade agreement in January 2021. But we don't think we should read much into these results because, as I've said, it's very hard to interpret given how FISIM are imputed. So we think the only way you can really capture changes in activity is by looking at stocks. And so we do observe stocks by partner country, and what we find is that there's actually a lot happening on the stock side. So we find that UK resident banks significantly reduced the amount of deposits and loan activity with the EU relative to the rest of the world, especially since January 2021. Interestingly, we also find that banks that had a higher share of EU-related activity before the referendum had experienced an even sharper decline in activity with the EU afterwards. For deposits, this decline in activity with the EU was compensated by an increase with activity outside the EU, so quite an interesting offsetting mechanism here, which meant that on aggregate, there was no much change in the amount of deposit activity UK banks had. On the loan side, we only see a decline with the EU activity and on aggregate a fall in loan activity. So we're still at a stage of investigating the mechanisms behind this, more specifically trying to understand whether that reflects EU banks moving away from the EU market or finding another way to serve the EU market. So we have done a lot more work on looking at intragroup activity. We're also looking at whether the response differs depending on whether the bank is a branch of the foreign bank and what's the nationality of the parent. So this is still a work in progress, and hopefully we'll have publish a paper sometime this year. But to conclude, maybe just very quickly on productivity. So at this stage, we unfortunately don't have much to say on productivity, but this is something we really would like to touch upon in future work. But what we already know is that there will be additional measurement challenges to face, again, on productivity. Productivity in the banking sector, because of the bulk of the output is this imputed FISIM, will also be a challenge to see and whether we can actually grasp the transformation that happened after Brexit, given the way FISIM are imputed. But also more conceptually, it's hard to know what is the best measure of productivity for banking services. So there is a little work in this area, a few papers suggesting using a unit cost of intermediation rather than standard measures like labor productivity. And so given the importance of the banking sector and the financial sector in the UK, I hope we're going to do more work on this area in the future.
Thank you, Sophie. So I think what we've heard from the panelists is that trade is a large, fascinating, complex, and actually quite challenging area to research. And one actually where getting good quality linked data is really important. So I'm going to kick off. We've got quite a bit of time for questions, so do have a think about questions for the panel, please, while I'm asking this first question. What should the ONS be doing to encourage better measurement of trade? and research on its impact, or indeed government in general? Who wants to kick off? Mairi?
I mean, I would say that the ONS has been doing what I would like to see more of, and that's using its sort of convening power as a holder of a lot of data on businesses, including the business register, which people who do research on businesses will be very familiar with. Getting data from the HMRC, bring it together with the other business data that they have in the ONS, and serving that up to researchers in a way which will encourage reuse and research. DBT, as the policy department, have been pushing for that as well. So seeing these three departments work together to ensure that the access to trade data can be much more simple for researchers, that it's not based on your ability to be at the HMRC data lab, which is a problem for people like me who live in Scotland, and that there are ways that researchers can access it so that it encourages use of this data. There are still a lot of challenges though, and we are at a measurement conference, so I think we can be a bit geeky about the issues around the fact that HMRC data is collected at the enterprise level, ONS data is collected at reporting unit level, and putting these two things together sounds like it should be easy, but it's not, and there are apportionment issues and challenges with the trading goods data, for example. So this is particularly important if it's a binary classification we're trying to do on firms. Are you an exporter or not? And we're also doing a bit of work with DBT at the moment on imports, which is the whole other side, which we don't talk about very often in terms of its importance in the way that we import. But firms that tend to export tend to import a lot more. They tend to employ more staff from other countries. Those firms that lift their eyes up to the world tend to exhibit a lot of these behaviours that we'd probably like to encourage in other firms in the economy. So I do think, for me, it's all about access to data and not just having the theoretical access in the SRS for particular data sets, but ensuring that the access conditions are such that we encourage as much research as possible on trade, so that researchers who are interested in trade don't focus on theory. I mean, that's good too, but I would like to see more empirical research, and that they don't test their theories with data from other countries, because it's just easier to access. We should be encouraging as much research as possible on trade.
Thank you. Anyone else have any thoughts?
I can add something to that. So yes. I really thought what Mairi said is just absolutely spot on. I think two things I'd add to that would be, one, linking data is the lowest hanging fruit, and you've already got those resources. It's just a matter of doing it. Michael Gaziorek at the CITP has put a letter together with some of the access issues that researchers are facing, and I mean, it almost feels irresponsible as a faculty member to tell your students to be working on the UK anymore, because those delays and access issues are just immense. And I'll sort of stop here with saying that one thing that I think the ONS has done really well, which is absolutely massive service, is the kind of linking up that you do on your own rather than having individual researchers do that and check each other's work. I think the ONS doing it for everyone is just such an immense public service. So, we want to see more of that.
Okay, message received. Thank you. So let's throw it open to the audience. Who wants to ask the first question? Just indicate by raising your hand. There are roving mics. Sanjeev at the back there.
Sanjeev Mahajan from the Office for National Statistics. I'm going to make an unusual plea in a moment, and apologies, Grant, it's in our favour. Firstly, I think the comments made are really interesting, and I think the emphasis on the financial services even more so, because we've probably got one of the most evolved, complicated, ever-changing, regulated area of that economy. I'm not saying we are the one, but it's very complex. So I've got two aspects. One is on data, and Mairi touched on it. There's a lot of data available. We don't necessarily have access, so the bank could actually help us in this arena, for sure. So there's a BEPS data, the Base Erosion Profits scheme, and the MOS data, both HMRC have. They will provide lots of information in some of the activities that are cross-border. Secondly, we need to improve the deflation of our service industries compared to our manufacturing, and that would improve the quality and the precision of the recording of the service industries, including the financial services. Now, on FISM, I think we might have an issue on the geographical, but on the national, we actually use your data. You supply it to us, so that could be interesting, the conclusions of your investigation. And I think regional trade, that's a big bugbear, and I know Mairi's smiling there. And then I think what hasn't been mentioned is analysis of inward facts and FDI. And when Brexit took place, there's massive effects there, and they're still continuing, but they're continuing for different reasons. So any thoughts on that from Greg would be useful. Now, I'm surprised this hasn't been mentioned, but I'm going to put a plug in for this because Swati mentioned about services, and we didn't really know the impact, etc. We're now in a position that I'm going to put a plug in for OECD and the Joint Research Commission from the European Commission, that extended supply and use tables as a framework are available, and extended input-output tables. Now, Mairi said for the geeks, I'm one of the geeks. What does that allow you to do? It allows you to have the data in a framework with the multipliers. So if you decide that for some policy reason you double the demand for a particular service, you have a multiplier effect from the input-output tables. These are extended, and the reason why it's important they're extended, not the traditional, is you separate out domestic businesses foreign-owned, and foreign-owned businesses in the UK. So you can actually have that granularity of the analysis. So money from the Bank of England to grant Fitzner will be really helpful to develop those and serve your purposes. Thank you.
Shameless plug this, Angie. If who would like to respond to one or more of those points? Sophie.
I'm a mere external member. I can't talk about the grant from the Bank of England, but I think the only thing I'd say here is I think that's again going back to the same issue of linking up across the bank, across DBT, HMRC, and the ONS. And finally, the supply use tables, absolutely. I mean, the fact that those kinds of supply use tables exist in the UK and the fact that they can be combined with the international trade and services data is the reason we could actually write papers about services, and not just on what happened to services itself, but to the broader economy. So, I mean, very grateful to you for doing that sort of exercise.
Yes, very quickly, just on data linking, I think this is a major point and an issue. Definitely, there is more data sources on this type of topics, and it's very hard to link them. Even accessing the data within the bank has been a challenge. Shania has been doing an internship 3 years ago, and we finally are now in a state where we can do some work on the data. So there's definitely some improvement to do on making data available for research and linking different data sources that would improve the quality of the work we would do. Just on FDI, also say something on the FDI. So we've started looking at FDI as well. Unfortunately, there's been a change in the way FDI has been recorded with looking through that. Before 2019, we were looking through holding companies, but now we also have data from the holding companies, which means that it's very hard to get consistent series, so it's hard to look into FDI. So far, we've kind of parked that. Hopefully, we can find a way to look at it in a sensible sense, but for now, we haven't found. So any ideas on this will be very welcome.
Anyone else?
I'll just add very briefly on FDI. So there's some evidence that FDI is like a substitute for trade, that you set up a sub in the UK or elsewhere because trade gets harder. And I think what I'd like to know more about is how we view this, how good a coping mechanism it is in a welfare sense. So the literature on FDI is that FDI is great because it encourages the spread of ideas. Foreign-owned companies tend to be much better managed than domestically owned ones. But if this is a different kind of FDI, which is used to kind of surmount trade barriers that didn't exist before, is it as good for welfare as that kind? Probably not, but it might still be better than nothing.
And just to say, Sanjeev, your point about extended supply and use and input tables is well made, and that's one of the approaches that we're doing in our research, looking at exporters and non-exporters. Essentially, that's what we want to decompose the table using as much microdata as possible to understand the real difference between exporters and non-exporters on GFCF, on their purchasing patterns and so on, so that we can produce better modelling when we're trying to understand the impact of different arrangements around trade. You mentioned regional trade. I mean, that is a big issue, and part of it's linked to the issue around supply and use tables. I know that regional supply news tables are being developed through a project by the OECD that's funded by DBT at the moment. And you know, whilst there's been a lot of work to try and produce better regional trade estimates, including international and inter-regional trade within the UK, you know, there are a lot of conceptual challenges with that that we might not solve through any data that exists. So it's about, you know, where is the trading happening, which unit are you assigning it to? All of these things are difficult, and they're particularly difficult given the way the business data is collected in the UK on a GB basis, which makes it quite difficult to do. So there, you know, I would say that one of the publications that ONS have released recently that was led by Chris Goldsworthy on regional trade continues this discussion, but it is just a continuation of the discussion and sets out some of the challenges. And indeed, that was based on original ESCoE research that I was involved in, you know, in 2016-17. That, for me, is a good example of where the sort of research we do through ESCoE can kind of be a slow burn to improve measurement and keep a conversation going, because it's sort of many years later that's really influencing the outputs that ONS are producing. And so, you know, does underline the benefits of having something like ESCoE.
Fantastic. We've got time for a few more questions. Who wants to be next? I'll go for the gentleman at the front there.
Hiya, my name's Zach, and I'm a data scientist and economist from the Department for Science, Innovation and Technology. I went to a session this morning on new data and methods, and it was quite interesting how they were being able to extend some data sets. So you said, for example, how data linking is low-hanging fruit. I guess, like, methodologically, it kind of is low-hanging fruit, but it's actually very tricky to do because it involves, like, organizations and working with lots of people. Is there any parts of your areas of focus where you've seen kind of new data and new methods, for example, being able to extend some data sets that you previously thought may have been not been able to use? For example, one of the sessions this morning was on using LLMs to basically extend survey responses because they were very representative and they had good evidence that it was a very good way to kind of bootstrap your survey responses. The second one was looking at trying to look at firms' annual reports to try and identify their use of interest rate derivatives, which was quite complicated to do because they often disguised it around a lot of things. So is there any areas in the past where you're looking at where you're thinking maybe these new methods could actually extend the data and allow you to look at things that we just don't collect information on, or we previously thought we didn't collect information on?
Who would like to respond?
I'll start. So one of the things we're looking at on the decision-making panel is using some of the text that firms produce. We haven't made a huge amount of progress yet, to be honest. So I'm very much open to ideas, and that's because, you know, not very many UK firms are listed, so you can't use the earnings calls in quite the same way. Lots of the firms that are listed in the UK don't do much business in the UK, and then. The text, the other kinds of text that firms produce is very heterogeneous across firms. But I would, if you've got any bright ideas, I would love to hear that, because it's obviously when we get it to work, it's going to be great.
Anyone else?
I can say a little bit about linking complicated data sets and the art and craft of it. And say that having worked for the ONS for 3 years, one of the things that you learn is that there's so much nuance when you bring in all these data sets to uncover what is a firm. So in the UK data sets, and it was quite funny because I've been at the OECD for a month, and they run these big projects like Multiprod, and my first question was like, so how do other countries identify what is a firm? And of course, if you're a little bit further away from the data, the answer sometimes you get is a bit like, the German Stats Authority does this for us. So better not get there. But if you work for the ONS, you have to get there. And in the data sets, you have a firm sort of manifesting as a tax entity, as a legal entity, and then as a statistical unit. And you can just kind of link these together. Some of them are not going to be one-to-one. And then you really need to understand how was this data created to understand what is meaningful to do. And then there's choices that need to be made. For example, we wouldn't have this issue of following the firm over time and questioning whether there's like new statistical units being created that we're missing if we went one level up. But of course, surveys are collected a level down, and if you go one level up, you're not going to have information about all the units underneath. So then you really need to work with people that have a long expertise. We had conversations with the IDBR, we had conversations with people doing supply and use tables at the ONS, which is to say not that you need to work for the ONS to understand these things, but that these links between ONS and the research community that are built a bit today as well are really, really vital to doing good quality work with these data sets. They're not going to get any easier in this country. This is how tax is collected. This is how sort of we collect survey information. I lost my train of thought now. But anyways, so it is complicated. And no, I remember what I was trying to say. So you know, you're faced with this choice of, do I aggregate up and then I don't have this kind of business formation question, or do I go with a lower unit but I have information for all units? And then it's about what research you're trying to do and what question you're trying to answer. So there's I guess, the research and the measurement really, really overlap. And I guess the other thing I would say really quickly is that sometimes we're not going to have perfect data for everything, but we have creativity and methods. And something I've been thinking, so two things that this applies to on trade is, well, okay, sometimes you're not going to have perfect deflators, but sometimes when the data allows it, you can use year by industry fixed effects, and that will do similar things. Or we don't have firm-to-firm transactions data, but in the peer effects literature, they say, well, kids interact within classrooms, so we know that what this matrix should look like. Thankfully, because of Keith and the bank transactions work at the ONS, we have SIG5 to SIG5 transactions. So could we use that and the co-movement of outcomes between firms to understand these relationships that we can't directly measure along supply chains? So long-winded, but hopefully helpful.
I think you just identified a whole bunch of new potential research angles there, Christina. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So we had a few questions on this side. So I can see Keith's got his hand up, but just wondering first if there's anyone on this side of the auditorium who's got a question. Apparently not. Keith.
Thank you. So there's a lot of work going on, and it seems the quality of the work and the questions being asked are really good. But as an economist, so I sort of take a step back and sort of look at the quality of the decision making on trade policy, especially recently, like looking at the US and all that, seems pretty poor. A lot of the decision seems really counterintuitive to what economists would think as good policy, and even sort of the numbers that go into sort of what the tariffs would be. Like it seems like really poor. So I wonder if sort of the panel sort of share this view that there's a big gap between the quality of decision making versus the level of evidence. And if so, sort of what is needed to close that gap? Is the answer, more work here by people in this room, do lots of better work? Like, is that going to close that gap, or what is needed?
I can start if you want. Well, without obviously getting political, and then in the end, the deals that have been done in the last couple of weeks are very political in the end. In terms of what the government is trying to, it depends what the government is trying to achieve through these trade deals, I suppose. And the US one isn't a trade deal, as we all know, it's a tariff deal. It's not a full trade agreement. The government needs to set out as part of that what it is trying to achieve. So we're all waiting for the trade strategy, for example, which I understand will be published around the same time as the spending review, alongside the industrial strategy, because of course your overall economic strategy and your trade strategy must be linked and go hand in hand. So that should set out the objectives the government wishes to achieve, and then external commentators, like some people on this panel, will then say, well, given the stated objectives of the government, to what extent are the things that they're actually doing going to lead to those objectives being achieved? And at the moment we don't have that strategy, and so one could say, do these all hang together to take us in one direction? One could definitely argue with that at the moment. It will be very interesting to see the trade strategy, and I suppose that's the sort of policy direction we should then measure these different agreements against. But the US one is clearly very different, perhaps, to the others, where the India one was a long time coming, and a lot of work has been done over the years to achieve it. And the EU one was obviously part of trying to fix some of the issues with the TCA. The US one was much more trying to minimise impacts, negative impacts that are likely to come because of higher tariff levels.
I can add something to that. The cheap answer is, well, if you want to see evidence-based policy making done, you need to produce the evidence. And that's what our job is, and we should be doing that. And the other answer would be that, you know, it's the work that gets done, the really detailed, careful work that then goes into good policy making. So I wish when we were writing our Economy 2030 inquiry report that we had the granular data that is starting to become available now, and we would have been able to pinpoint precisely which sectors, which types of services, which types of barriers were important to put into a trade strategy. But because everything else was so delayed, and particularly on the FDI side, that, you know, we weren't able to give an accurate picture of those things, and that's really what our job should have been, and we weren't able to do it. So all the work that you're doing, I think ultimately, yes, it does feed into policy, and it's our job to ensure that it feeds into policy.
I'll just add something. So trying to be a little bit more upbeat or charitable. So I think the government could have announced like retaliation to the tariffs that Donald Trump announced, and the review of the Resolution Foundation was that would be like a bad idea because we're quite small and also because imports are good. So the point of exports is to pay for imports, and that it would have been counterproductive for the UK to retaliate and probably made things worse rather than better. And I think the government, you know, I don't know whether it was because we said it, probably not, but I think that's an example of a mistake they could have made but didn't. And then I think the other thing to say is that to be fair to the government, like it's all very well for people like me to hop up and down and say it's simple, just join the single market and the customs union, but that's not simple, and it's not without trade-offs as well, because a country of this size being in those two things without the same kind of decision-making power, it would have some, I think, and some requirement of consultation, would also create political issues going forward. So I think to be fair to the government, they probably wouldn't want to be starting from here, and I have some sympathy with how they're managing the hand that they've been dealt personally.
And these aren't just economic decisions; they're so political that we all need to remember that when they're being made.
Thank you. So look, I think that's been a really rich and interesting discussion. I hope you've learned something, and I hope that there's a few people in the audience who are now very motivated to go and do some more trade research and take advantage of the fabulous and ever-improving data sources that were discussed today. So can we please thank the panelists and Christina. Thank you. Quite a bit of ground, isn't it?
Yeah.